This next video begins a series about women and the history of women in visual arts. So we'll be thinking about women as subjects, women as artists, and also a few examples of women as patrons, so women who purchased art. But mostly in this video series we'll be focusing on women as artists. But just to start off the series, we want to look at some examples of women as subjects. So how were women represented in art? So we'll have this particular video about women more as goddesses and how they were represented as goddesses or divine or sacred figures. And then in some upcoming videos, you'll see examples of women as more virtuous and then women as scandalous, because we do often see women pigeonholed into this role as a troublemaker. Then the series will continue on with more examples of women actually as artists, as creators, and also a few women patrons. So just to start off, we're going to be thinking about, as I said, women as these more divine figures and as sacred figures. That's the focus of this video. And so a good place to start is this very famous woman of Willendorf. She's also featured in my Paleolithic video, the first video I loaded a long time ago. But the Paleolithic period is a period, the Old Stone Age. This dates to approximately 28,000 to 25,000 BCE, so the period before Common Era. And this is a period, of course, that's very difficult for us to interpret because in the Paleolithic period we have no writing, so we have no written records of what was being done at this time. All we have is the archaeology and the artworks that survive to us. You'll notice also from that date range, 28,000 to 25,000 BCE, that our date ranges are very general. We don't have precise dates the same way we do for much later works of art. This is made of limestone, so stone sculpture is very enduring. It tends to last a long time. It's also probably been rubbed with some kind of red pigment. You can see remnants of that as well. It's small, so just over 4 inches high. It is an important key work for our class. And of course, whenever we look at this sculpture, we can clearly see that certain parts of her body have been greatly exaggerated. So her breasts, her belly, her thighs, her genitalia. So this idea that she is, all of these kind of fertile aspects of her body have been greatly highlighted to bring our attention to those areas of her body. So this idea that in the Paleolithic period, women were often featured in artwork. In fact, we see more representations of women than men in what we find in archaeological discoveries. And so many people believe that women may have been seen as important goddesses in this society, that they may have been used, in this case, of course, as fertility figures. So maybe something like this would have been brought in when a woman was giving birth or for a woman who hoped to become pregnant. Or maybe this was something that would ward off evil because you have this ideal of a very healthy, fleshy female figure. It doesn't seem to be a particular portrait because we don't have those portrait features. Maybe this is a kind of hairstyle or headdress, or the idea that the artist doesn't need to emphasize the face. You can see that the arms themselves curve up along the breast. That's often easy to miss. And then, of course, the feet themselves were quite small and seem to have kind of broken off there at the bottom. And so very important early work that indicates the importance of fertility figures even from the earliest history of art. So this, of course, is in Western Europe. This is Willendorf in modern-day Austria. And so this is something we see in Austria, but we've had similar discoveries in other areas as well. To move forward many thousands of years to see another example of a kind of goddess figure is this statuette of Isis and Horus. So Isis is the goddess here. You see her here wearing a vulture headdress, which is a marker of queens and goddesses. And then also the throne on her headdress is a hieroglyph for Isis. So hieroglyph is the writing system in ancient Egypt. And then you see her here, very smooth, beautifully sculpted body using this material of what's called faience. It's kind of like a glass, so it's this very luminous blue material, and it's very lustrous. So it was very good to use for sculptures of goddesses or divine figures. So we can see her sitting here. Obviously her breasts are shown, and she's breastfeeding her child Horus. So both are divine figures. Isis was an important mother figure, also associated, she was married or the consort of Osiris, lord of the underworld, and then her son was Horus, an important protector of the pharaohs or the leaders of Egypt. So you see her here doing the role of a good mother, breastfeeding her child, offering that kind of nurturing aspect. So you see her holding Horus with this kind of very adult-looking body. Often god figures, even when their kids are represented, looking very adult-like to show them proper respect and to show that they had great knowledge even very early on in life. You can see the very typical Egyptian headdresses on both, and also the kind of plaited hairstyles, especially, of course, on Isis here. And the kind of clinging fabric that drapes her legs, also very common in Egyptian art. But what's important about this sculpture in particular, and other sculptures of Isis where she's shown breastfeeding Horus, not only this idea that she's a good mother, but this idea that this iconography, or this kind of style of combining these two figures as mother and child, will actually be influential once Christian artwork is created. So this idea that eventually we're going to see the Virgin and Child, the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, in a very similar pose. So we think early artists, ancient artists, were inspired by the Isis-Horus tradition and eventually used the same kind of style for the Virgin Mary and Christ child. So it's interesting how these images of women can be repurposed for later religions and for later ideals. Another important early goddess that was very, very popular is a figure named Artemis of Ephesus. This was a major cult figure in the area of Anatolia, so the area of modern-day Turkey. She was known as a great mother goddess, so hopefully you're seeing a common theme of women often being associated with a great mother figure. She was also known as lady or kind of controller of animals, so we often see animals featured in replicas of this sculpture. So we no longer have the original. The original sculpture was at the site of Ephesus, but it was probably made of wood and lost in a very large 4th century fire. But this Artemis of Ephesus commanded a great following. A number of people followed her, and she was also associated with ideas of fertility, again, very common for women. So it was long believed that these kind of bumps on the front of her being were breasts, lots and lots of breasts, this kind of ideal, again, of fertility. But other people have now said that maybe they were gourds, symbols of fertility, or another recent interpretation is bull's testicles. So this is something that's still being explored, but that's probably the most recent and agreed upon idea. She also often has representations of nature or the zodiac on her body. Again, connections to animals were really common. And then sometimes she's represented with a crown that shows city walls, the idea of being a city protectress. So we often see ancient sculptures around this time where women would have that kind of what we call a mural crown. And so those city walls would be represented on her crown. Not in this case, but in some examples. Another important ancient goddess is, of course, Venus, or in the Greek version, Aphrodite. And this one is called the Venus de Medici because it was collected by the very important family of the Renaissance, the Medici family in Florence, that were very interested in commissioning not only Renaissance artists, but also collecting ancient works of art in order to inform their collection. And so in this particular example, Venus, so Roman form, Aphrodite, Greek form, she's the goddess of love and lust. She was often represented in the nude after a particular point in ancient art. So the sculptor Praxiteles represented her in this particular pose where she's covering up her breasts and genitalia. In the original version, this idea that she's either getting out of the bath, just getting out, or just getting in, and we've kind of surprised her. And so this idea that she's covering herself up in response. So it's supposed to be a particularly exciting or titillating sculpture, but also it provided opportunities for artists to study the female body. Because early in Greek history, we didn't see a lot of women represented in the nude. So with this sculpture by Praxiteles, we see a very important development towards more female nudity and more understanding of the female body. And again, Aphrodite was not a virginal or maiden goddess, the same way Athena or Artemis were. And so she was a more acceptable goddess to be represented in the nude. Thinking about cultures outside of Europe and northern Africa, outside of the Mediterranean, and going all the way to Japan, we see a figure, a very important painting from Japan, from the Nara, probably from the Nara period, called Kichijjōten. And this is a figure also associated with fertility, with good harvest. Again, it's in pretty rough shape. It's on a piece of hemp, and it's disintegrating. But we see her represented in these gorgeous garments. She's holding a wish-granting jewel. She's also lowering her hand in this direction, indicating it's a gesture of charity, that she is willing to, again, kind of grant the wishes of those who pray to her. She's marked as very important not only by this extraordinary garment that she wears, but also by this halo that circles her. We've lost a lot of her headdress, but that also would have been a marker of important status. She's also showing us the kind of ideal beauty of Japan in the 8th century. That's often what these goddesses do as well, kind of what was the ideal representation of a specific gender at that time. And so in this case, the ideal Japanese woman was supposed to be a little bit more fleshy. Earlier it had been kind of a thinner type, and here we're starting to see a fuller, fleshier figure. So we see a full face, these kind of crescent-shaped eyebrows, these bright red lips, the hairstyle pulled back. And so many people believe this is a strong influence from Tang China. There was a dynasty, the Tang dynasty in China, that was had very international appeal and strength, and so the art style was also very influential. So we believe that this particular representation of a figure connected to traditions of style from China, and then also traditions of fortune, good fortune from India, because many people think she's also associated with the goddess Lakshmi from the Hindu tradition in India. So a really interesting example of beauty, and then also a bringer of fortune and charity. Moving on to an example connected to Hinduism, I wanted to look particularly at the figure of Uma, or sometimes called Parvati, from this example of what's called a Chola bronze. So we've moved over to South Asia, so we moved from East Asia and Japan over to South Asia and India, and here we see an example of kind of this whole holy, important family. So Uma, represented here, is the consort of Shiva. And Shiva is one of the greatest, if not the most powerful, gods in the Hindu pantheon. And so we see him here very prominent with his hair matted on his head, with his attributes, his multiple hands showing his great abilities, his extensive jewelry. They're both in a pose of royal ease, where the leg is rested, one on top and one kind of coming down. And then we also see them with their son Skanda. So we see them as this representation of really an ideal family of that time. So Shiva is very powerful, the husband, Uma as the wife, and then of course their offspring. And Skanda was a very important figure who will be associated with war. This is in a tradition of what's called the Chola bronzes that were often processed and decorated. So they were very important right around the year 1000 in southern India. But something to point out, even though both these figures are very important and very prominent, and both are exemplifying, when I'm talking about Shiva and Uma, both are exemplifying ideal roles of husband and wife, it's clear that the wife is very secondary to the husband. You can see that she's much smaller in size. She's definitely, her beauty is highlighted. She is wearing more jewelry, which was expected of women of that time, and which we'll see in multiple cultures. But just this idea that a woman's role was very often seen as secondary to the man. So she doesn't have quite the level of power, strength, and importance as Shiva. So just important to keep that in mind. Moving on to the Renaissance, to the 15th century in Florence, we're looking at a sculpture by the artist Donatello that is currently on display in front of it's currently inside the City Hall of Florence, but there's also a replica outside of the City Hall. It was it was a representation of a story called Judith and Holofernes. So this is a story coming from Old Testament Apocrypha, a story of a very virtuous widow named Judith. So the idea of the widow is sometimes important in the history of women and art because widows can sometimes get away with more than other women. So these women who have been married but their husbands have died are sometimes granted more rights and privileges in certain societies. So in this case, Judith was able to save her people by getting into the tent of an Assyrian general, taking advantage of the situation, and eventually killing him with the help of a maidservant. So we often see representations where a maidservant is present as well. So you see her here with her curved sword raised aloft. She's already sliced into his neck once, so you see that it looks a little bit disconnected in some ways, and she's about to make that kind of final blow. You can see that he was probably drinking before this, he's a little out of it, and that's how Judith was able to take advantage of this. So she was able to save her people by killing this general, and the story goes that many people wanted to marry her after this, but she maintained her widowhood. She never married again and remained faithful to her husband who had died. So that's another common theme, the idea that a woman is supposed to be loyal to a single man. There is an inscription on this: kingdoms fall through luxury or sin, cities rise through virtues, behold the neck of pride severed by the hand of humility. So this idea that a very ancient story could be repurposed for a Renaissance, an Italian Renaissance audience. Okay, nearly done. We're looking at another example of a Renaissance work of art, this time coming from Flanders, so the area of approximately around modern-day Belgium. So Jan van Eyck was a very important painter from the early to mid-15th century, and we're looking at an example called The Virgin in the Church. And of course, the Virgin Mary is often seen as this kind of ultimate virtuous symbol. And her body was equated with the church itself, that she was kind of the home where everyone would gather, and that she was this important figure linked to that structure. And so you see her here as a queen wearing this beautiful crown within a church, but her body is really filling up the church itself. So an actual church, a human, would be about kind of this high in a traditional Gothic church from this time. But she's extending all the way up towards those upper windows. This idea that she's a supernatural, divine figure cradling her child in a similar way to how we saw Isis holding Horus. But this idea that she is equated with this shelter that will shelter all the congregants, so bringing everyone together. You can see the church itself is very typical in that Gothic style, which was very popular in the 13th and 14th centuries throughout Western Europe. Jan van Eyck was also a master of oil painting technique, so really wonderful at the application of detail in his paintings. So hopefully as you look at this particular work, you're noticing some of those extraordinary details, such as the crown that I mentioned, the rich colors that are used, the detail in the architecture and in the stained glass, the ornamentation on the Gothic pointed arches, these little crockets that line the outer portion, the relief sculpture that lines the screen, or that decorates the screen between the main area of the church and the area of the high altar. So it also gives you a sense of what churches looked like around 500 years ago. Our final key work for this lecture, which relates to spiritual women figures, sacred women figures, is the figure of Mami Wata, who is a really significant figure in Western Africa, Central Africa. There's examples in Southern Africa, and then also related to the diaspora. Her iconography, so the way she's represented with certain symbols, was really solidified through European contact. So there was some influence from certain prints that were being brought into Africa. So this idea of the figure being represented with this parted black hair, the snakes that surround her, the idea that she's represented as a snake charmer. But she is a water spirit, and there's a long history of water spirits in these African cultures, lots of different ones. And so she's often represented in different ways. She often was a part of masks, so that's how we're seeing her here from the Ivory Coast. So you see a mask below with a reddish face, also evidence of scarification, which is common in some African cultures. This is from the mid-20th century, and this became a common feature of masks around this time. Masks are also commonly produced in Western Africa, and a lot of the different cultures there produce them. So you can see the snakes that surround the figure. You also can see a male snake charmer down below, but you can see the prominence of Mami Wata over that male figure. So kind of an interesting contrast to the Shiva and Uma example. But very dynamic, lots of movement to the snakes. You get that sense of her power and her control. There's a wide belief that she can bring financial prosperity, also fertility. So she's definitely a significant figure. Altars are often placed to honor her, and then other types of imagery is often created. So she's an especially popular, this kind of mother water figure, is an especially popular water spirit that brings much devotion, again, in these many areas of Africa. So I just wanted to show you one example from Western Africa, from the Ivory Coast. All right, so we'll end there. Hopefully this gives you a good introduction to women, sacred women, women as heroines, women as divine figures. And we'll move on to women as virtuous and scandalous in our next videos.